West Point, the world that we have today was scarcely imaginable in January 1963. In that same month, also 50 years ago, this same month, George Wallace took office in Alabama with an inaugural address famously pledging segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Looking at a world that was segregated, as I said, by race down into the state constitutions, and that had defined partisan politics in the United States, such that the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy and the party of segregation throughout the southern states. There was not one single Republican member of the House of Representatives between Texas and the Atlantic Ocean. There were no Republicans. When I grew up in Atlanta, Republicans, as I say, often were as scarce as polar bears. There were only Daddy King's black and tan Republicans who were after patronage jobs and a few eccentric judges who believed in the two-party system. Everybody else was a Democrat because the Democrats had ended Lincoln and ended Reconstruction and were the party of solidarity. Since then, this movement transformed politics, transformed our world in ways that we suppress because we have a terrible history in the United States of making any cross-racial memory comfortable to ourselves at the expense of accuracy, hope, or the promise of liberty. We did it in the Civil War for 100 years, as Nick Lemon makes clear in his contribution to this issue. And what I'm trying to argue is that we have done it for 50 years now in relation to the Civil Rights Movement. The liberations set free in the past 50 years in the world that we don't remind ourselves of, not just in race, not just in gender, not just in gays. The word gay wasn't even invented 50 years ago. It was beyond the imagination of the most visionary liberal. It referred to a crime that dared not speak its name. And now, having set loose all this liberation, what dares not speak its name is the word liberal to claim credit for the things that it set in motion. And conservatives are debating gay marriage versus civil unions, and yet claiming a triumph for conservative politics in resentment against government that made all these things possible. So what I'm trying to argue for you is that this little moment, this little minuet between Kennedy and Martin Luther King about the Emancipation Proclamation should be a wake-up call for us to remember that we don't remember things across racial lines better, that we improve ourselves, that race is the doorway to discovery, but it is profoundly uncomfortable, even today, for most of the dominant culture, to the point that millions of white people voted for Barack Obama, but they voted for Barack Obama on their terms. And one of their terms is that he not talk about race. As this issue says, he's talked about race less than any president in the last 50 years. I think that's no accident because we are still limited and turning away from the upside of our own history. So what I'm hoping is that this January 1963 begins a march of 50-year anniversaries that goes forward from now. 1963 and 2013 will be the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham campaign, the dogs and the fire hoses, the death of Medgar Evers, the introduction of the Civil Rights Bill, the March on Washington, the Birmingham church bombing, the Kennedy assassination, the longest filibuster in history in 1964, the 64 Civil Rights Act, and Selma. Most overlooked, the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 in the wake of Selma, which opened up naturalized citizenship to the whole world, repealing a system that had restricted it mostly to the nations of Northern Europe. And Lyndon Johnson said, when he signed it under the Statue of Liberty, never again will the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege shadow the gate to freedom, because it's going to be first come, first serve, and invisibly in the 48 years since, we have communities from all over the world proving that we are not only a pioneer democracy in concept and in evolution, but actually in practice, from all over the world. And these are profoundly inspiring things, and I hope that the next 5 years of anniversaries will help us outgrow and get a more proper balance about the promise of politics, what we can do. We should be profoundly optimistic that we can tackle serious problems once again. But instead, in my view, we are still imprisoned by a Reconstruction, post-Civil War blindness that shapes the whole landscape such that we're not even aware of it. We're not aware that we are imprisoned in language that was largely invented by the same George Wallace who failed to protect segregation forever, but in his failure was a genius enough of a politician to invent phrases of resentment and fear against the tides that were liberating America by denouncing pointy-headed bureaucrats in Washington who were trying to tell people how to run their businesses and where they should go to school, and that they were in cahoots with a biased media that had a racial agenda to concentrate all effective power on the central government in Washington with its tax and spend liberals. Every one of those phrases is vintage George Wallace, and every one of them is chillingly contemporary. It is an attitude far more than a judgment that imprisons our politics, shuts us off not only from accurate history, but shuts us off from the promise of democracy. So I'm hoping that this issue of the monthly, focusing on race, and you are focusing on this issue, people's resistance to it, people's resistance to discuss race, to insist simultaneously that race is solved and that it is unsolvable, propositions that have in common only that they both mean we don't need to discuss it. This issue discusses it. The civil rights movement and our history shows us that when we do discuss it, when we get beyond our comfort zones, when we learn things, that's when good things happen. That's when that's the doorway to the promise of freedom. So until we're as comfortable discussing race as we are sports, America is still not there yet, and I hope that we can take advantage of this amazingly resonant time. We're marching through these 50-year anniversaries, and advantage of the articles here to really bring our history back into balance, bring our country back into balance, and address the problems of the future with intelligence and with patriotism. Thank you.